3 months earlier, I stood in the driveway of my new home, keys still warm in my palm from the realtor's handoff. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the freshly mowed lawn, highlighting the crisp white trim against the blue siding. After years of apartment living, this modest three-bedroom ranch house represented everything I had worked for, a place completely my own, without rules or restrictions. My attention immediately turned to the detached garage. While the house itself was in good condition, the previous owners had neglected this space. Peeling paint, cracked concrete, and decades of dust greeted me as I pushed open the creaking door. Despite its condition, I could see the potential. This would be my first renovation project, a space for my truck, my woodworking tools, and perhaps most importantly, a sanctuary where I could work with my hands after long days at the office. From where I stood, I could see the pristine development that bordered my property to the east. Identical two-story colonials with perfect landscaping stretched in neat rows, each mailbox the same forest green with gold numbering. A decorative stone marker reading Oakwood Estates stood at the entrance to their street, though technically my house shared the same road name, Oakwood Drive. "Welcome to the neighborhood," called a voice from across the yard. An older man with silver hair waved from his garden next door. "Name is Frank. Good to see someone moving in finally." I walked over and introduced myself, explaining my plans for renovating the garage first. Frank nodded approvingly, but I noticed his eyes darting toward the development behind us. "Just so you know," he said in a lowered voice, "your property sits outside the HOA line. They might try to tell you otherwise, but this house and mine were built before the development. We are grandfathered out of their rules." I thanked him for the information, though at the time it seemed inconsequential. Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into the garage renovation. I sealed the concrete floor to a gleaming finish, installed new windows to let in natural light, built a custom workbench along the back wall, and organized my tools with meticulous care. The space transformed from neglected storage to functional workshop, with enough room for 2 vehicles plus my woodworking area. One evening, while carrying paint supplies from my truck, I noticed a gathering at the community gazebo visible from my driveway. About 20 residents stood listening to a woman with highlighted blonde hair gesturing emphatically. Her voice carried across the distance, sharp and authoritative, though I could not make out her words. The residents nodded in unison at whatever proclamation she was making. My first indirect encounter with this woman came days later at the local hardware store. I was selecting hinges for cabinet doors when I overheard her berating a young employee about paint colors being discontinued. "Do you have any idea how important color consistency is in a planned community? This is completely unacceptable," she declared, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the fluorescent light as she pointed at the color swatches. The employee, barely 20, looked close to tears. I avoided eye contact and moved to another aisle, making a mental note of her imperious attitude. The following Tuesday, returning from work, I discovered a cream-colored business card wedged into my door frame. "Barbara Winters, Community Oversight Committee Chair," it read in bold serif font. Below the title, a handwritten note stated, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Please schedule compliance review." A phone number was circled twice in blue ink. That evening, I pulled up my property documents on my laptop and researched county records online. The plat maps confirmed exactly what Frank had told me. My property line fell precisely 18 feet outside the Oakwood Estates HOA boundary. I was, without question, not subject to their regulations or oversight. Something about that business card sent an unexpected chill down my spine. I placed it in my desk drawer, deciding to ignore it for now. Little did I know this small piece of cardstock was the first shot in what would become a neighborhood war. The mountains had been exactly what I needed that weekend: fresh air, hiking trails, and complete disconnection from email and phone calls. 3 days of camping had reset my mind and body. Sunday evening, I turned onto Oakwood Drive, gravel crunching beneath my truck tires, eager to unload my gear and prepare for the work week ahead. As I approached my house, my headlights swept across something unusual. My garage door stood wide open, the interior lights illuminating what appeared to be an unfamiliar vehicle parked inside. I slowed to a stop in my driveway, confusion quickly turning to disbelief. There, occupying the left side of my garage, sat a gleaming white Tesla Model X, its chrome details reflecting the overhead lights. I parked my truck in the driveway and approached cautiously, wondering if perhaps a neighbor had emergency car troubles and needed temporary shelter. No note was visible on the vehicle or the workbench. Nothing explained the presence of this luxury SUV in my private garage. Inside the house, I immediately checked my new security camera system. Rewinding to Friday afternoon, approximately 3 hours after I had left for my camping trip, the footage showed a well-dressed blonde woman confidently walking up my driveway. I recognized her immediately as Barbara Winters from the hardware store incident. She looked directly at the camera, pressed something in her hand, and my garage door obediently rolled upward. With the casual air of someone entering their own property, she drove the white Tesla inside, exited the vehicle, and closed the garage door behind her before walking away. How had she obtained a garage door opener? I had not changed the frequency since moving in, a critical oversight I now deeply regretted. I spent a restless night wondering how to address this bizarre violation. The following morning, before leaving for work, I wrote a polite but firm note explaining that my property was not part of the HOA territory and requesting immediate removal of the vehicle. I placed it under the Tesla's windshield wiper and left for the office. When I returned that evening, I discovered not one but two vehicles in my garage. The white Tesla had been joined by a sleek black model with custom license plates reading WNTRS2. Both notes had been removed, yet the vehicles remained unmoved. They occupied the entire garage space, forcing me to leave my truck in the driveway overnight. That evening, I performed an internet search for Barbara Winters' Oakwood Estates. Several community newsletter PDFs appeared, featuring Barbara prominently as the HOA president for the past 5 years. One article particularly caught my attention, a piece celebrating her successful community integration initiatives that had maintained property values above county averages. The accompanying photo showed Barbara standing proudly beside a stone marker, her expression suggesting someone who enjoyed her authority immensely. I tried calling the number on her business card multiple times throughout the evening. Each attempt went straight to voicemail. At 9:17 p.m., however, a text message appeared on my phone, helping you integrate into our neighborhood standards. We'll discuss during next community meeting on Thursday. Compliance is mandatory for all properties on Oakwood Drive. The following morning, I attempted to visit Barbara's house directly before work. Her two-story colonial with perfect landscaping was easy to identify. It stood at the center of the development, larger than the surrounding homes, with both a circular driveway and a 3-car garage. Despite seeing movement behind the curtains, no one answered my repeated knocks. By Wednesday, the situation remained unchanged. Both Teslas still occupied my garage, and Barbara remained conveniently unavailable. When I called the general HOA number listed on their community website, the secretary informed me that President Winters is handling special jurisdiction cases personally and could not be disturbed. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at property maps and HOA documentation I had printed from the county records website. There was absolutely no legal basis for what was happening. My property sat definitively outside HOA boundaries, and no amount of community integration could change that geographic and legal fact. As rain pattered against my windows, I realized this was no simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to assert control where none existed. Barbara Winters was not confused about boundary lines. She was deliberately ignoring them, counting on my eventual surrender to her authority through sheer persistence and inconvenience. I changed into rain gear, grabbed a flashlight, and headed to the garage. It was time to reclaim my space and send a clear message. The first step would be changing my garage door frequency immediately, and the second would be understanding exactly who and what I was dealing with. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight as I leaned against my fence, listening to my neighbor Frank. His weathered hands gestured toward the development behind us, voice lowered conspiratorially despite no one being within earshot. "Barbara tried the same thing with the Johnsons last year," he explained, wiping sweat from his brow. "They lived in your house before you. Good people, but they could not handle the constant pressure." Frank detailed how the previous owners had faced escalating harassment, citations for non-existent violations, anonymous complaints, and eventually, their children being excluded from the community pool despite the facility being open to all Oakwood Drive residents per the original development agreement. "They sold for 15% below market value just to escape," Frank concluded. "Barbara had one of her real estate friends handle the sale. I always suspected they hoped to purchase your lot and officially incorporate it into the HOA territory." This information transformed my understanding of the situation. What I had experienced was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a systematic campaign. With renewed determination, I spent my lunch break the following day at the county records office. The records clerk, a woman with gray hair and patient eyes, helped me locate the original subdivision plans from 1997. The document clearly showed boundary markers, with my property and Frank sitting precisely 18 feet outside the HOA line. An addendum noted that these two properties were excluded from community governance and restrictions in perpetuity. That evening, I installed additional security cameras around my property, covering all approaches to both house and garage. I also called a locksmith who replaced my garage door opener system entirely, with a modern encrypted frequency that could not be easily duplicated. The mechanical hum of the new motor testing felt like a small victory. The confrontation came sooner than I anticipated. The following morning, as I prepared to leave for work, a sharp knock rattled my front door. Barbara Winters stood on my porch, immaculately dressed in a navy pantsuit, her highlighted hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Behind her, parked in my driveway, I could see her white Tesla had returned. "Good morning," she said with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "I believe we need to discuss your integration into our community standards." "Good morning, Ms. Winters," I replied, remaining in the doorway without inviting her in. "I understand there has been some confusion. My property is not part of Oakwood Estates HOA. This has been confirmed through county records." Her smile did not waver as she extracted a folder from her designer handbag. "These community aesthetic agreements supersede simple boundary questions. Your commercial vehicle violates Section 8.3 of our guidelines." She gestured toward my work truck parked in the driveway. The vehicle was clean and well-maintained, with my company logo on the door, hardly an eyesore by any reasonable standard. Ms. Winters, I have verified through county records that my property sits outside HOA jurisdiction. I am not subject to your guidelines or regulations, I explained again, keeping my tone professional despite growing frustration. Her expression hardened. Properties like yours lower neighborhood values for everyone. The inconsistency damages our community aesthetic and impacts property assessments. The conversation grew increasingly tense as Barbara refused to acknowledge the legal boundaries. At one point, she stepped closer, diamond tennis bracelet catching sunlight as she gesticulated toward my truck. That commercial vehicle disappears by tomorrow or it gets towed, she stated, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Your little property loophole does not change community standards. After she left, I contacted the local police department's non-emergency line to inquire about my rights. The officer confirmed that without my consent, no one could legally tow a vehicle from my property regardless of any HOA regulations. Later that week, while shopping for groceries, I overheard two women discussing that eyesore on Oakwood Drive and how someone should do something about all those code violations. When they mentioned my specific address, I realized Barbara had been actively spreading misinformation about my property throughout the community. I spent that weekend installing a proper fence along my property line, taking careful measurements to ensure it complied with county regulations while clearly marking my boundaries. As I worked, several cars slowed to observe me, their occupants clearly residents from the development. None stopped to introduce themselves, but their scrutiny felt palpable. By Sunday evening, I had a new fence, new security cameras, a new garage door system, and a growing sense that this conflict was far from over. Barbara had shown her hand. This was not about community aesthetics or property values. This was about control, about establishing authority where none legally existed. As I stored my tools that evening, I noticed a glossy flyer had been placed on my front porch. Community meeting, Thursday 7 p.m., special discussion, boundary enforcement and property standards. The image showed a perfect row of houses, all identical, all conforming. I pinned it to my refrigerator as a reminder. This was no longer just about parking. This was about my right to own my property without interference. The lines had been drawn, literally and figuratively. Barbara had made her position clear. Now it was time for me to stand my ground. Tuesday afternoon, I pulled into my driveway after a grueling workday to discover my garage door standing half open. A sense of dread washed over me as I approached, already knowing what I would find. Despite the changed frequency and new security measures, both Teslas had returned. The white Model X and the black model with WINTRS2 license plates parked side by side in my garage. I extracted my phone and activated the flashlight, inspecting the concrete floor. Fresh scratches gouged the surface where expensive Tesla wheels had been maneuvered into place, damaging the ceiling I had so carefully applied. My custom workbench had been shifted several inches from the wall, its corner splintered where it had clearly been struck by a vehicle. Tools that I had organized meticulously now sat in different positions, or had been moved to make room for the cars. The security footage revealed the full extent of the invasion. Barbara had somehow obtained access to my new garage door frequency, perhaps through connections with the installation company. The video showed her arriving with 3 other people from the neighborhood, all of them entering my garage as if conducting an official inspection. They moved my belongings, rearranged my tools, and appeared to take measurements of the space. I immediately called the police. 2 officers arrived 30 minutes later, reviewed my security footage, and inspected the property. Despite clear evidence of trespassing and property damage, their response was disappointing. "This appears to be a civil dispute between neighbors," the senior officer explained, handing me a community mediation services pamphlet. "Without evidence of forced entry, this falls outside our jurisdiction." When I pointed out the damaged workbench and floor, he suggested I document everything for small claims court. The subtext was clear. Without more serious damage or threat, law enforcement considered this a low-priority matter. The following day, I received an official letter from the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal complaint citing my property for multiple violations of community standards and demanding compliance within 10 business days. The document was signed by Barbara Winters as HOA president and included a fine schedule for continued noncompliance. Thursday afternoon, while selecting lumber at the local hardware store, I encountered a young woman who looked remarkably like Barbara. The same highlighted hair and sharp features, but approximately 20 years younger. She approached me directly, blocking my path between aisles. "My mother says you need to stop being difficult," she declared loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Just sign the HOA integration paperwork and this all goes away. We have been accommodating so far, but that will change if you continue resisting." "I assume you are Barbara's daughter," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the public confrontation. "Please inform your mother that my property is not part of the HOA, and I have no intention of signing any integration documents. Also, parking in my garage without permission constitutes trespassing." Her eyes narrowed. "That garage has been designated as overflow parking for residents during our pool renovation. Your constant removal of the vehicles is disrupting community plans that were approved months ago." The conversation grew increasingly hostile until a store employee intervened, asking if everything was all right. Barbara's daughter departed with a final warning that making this difficult will only make things worse for you. That same afternoon, my doorbell camera activated while I was still at work. The footage showed Barbara leading 4 residents on what appeared to be a tour of my property. She gestured toward my garage, her voice clearly audible on the recording. "As discussed in our meeting, this space has been designated for community overflow parking during the pool renovation. The current resident is being difficult about community requirements, but the board is handling the situation." The residents nodded, one asking about dimensions and capacity. Barbara assured them the garage could easily accommodate 3 vehicles plus seasonal storage requirements for pool equipment and holiday decorations. I sat at my work desk, watching this unfold on my phone in real time, completely stunned by the boldness of her actions. This was no longer boundary pushing. This was a complete disregard for property rights and law. The final straw came Saturday morning. I discovered the padlocked side entrance to my garage had been forced open, the hasp completely broken from the frame. Inside, my carefully organized storage bins had been pushed against one wall, creating an empty space where a pile of pool equipment now sat, chlorine tablets, testing kits, and maintenance tools I did not own. A handwritten sign taped to the wall read, "Community Pool Supplies, Authorized Access Only." I stood in my violated garage, surveying the damage and intrusion. The scratched floors, the damaged workbench, my displaced belongings, and now this community property being forcibly stored in my private space. Something inside me finally snapped. This was no longer about parking or community aesthetics or property values. This was breaking and entering. This was destruction of property. This was theft of space. As I photographed every detail of the damage and intrusion, a clarity settled over me. Polite requests had failed. Direct confrontation had failed. Even security measures had been circumvented. Barbara Winters had escalated this beyond a neighborhood dispute into something requiring a more strategic and comprehensive response. I pulled out my phone and searched for real estate attorney near me, then sorted by highest ratings. As I did, a notification from my security system showed Barbara's daughter approaching my front door with what appeared to be documents in hand. I watched through the camera as she deposited an envelope marked "Final Notice" in my mailbox. The time for passive response had ended. I needed professional help, documentation, and a plan that would end this situation definitively. As I made the call to schedule an urgent consultation with an attorney, I felt something shift within me, a cold determination replacing the shock and outrage. Barbara Winters had declared war on my property rights. Now she would discover I was not an enemy she should have created. The real estate attorney's office exuded confidence and authority. Leather-bound law books lined mahogany shelves, and the subtle scent of polish and paper filled the air. Carolyn Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, reviewed my evidence folder methodically, occasionally making notations or pausing to examine photographs more closely. "This is textbook harassment and trespassing," she confirmed, sliding the satellite imagery across her desk. The image clearly showed boundary markers separating my property from HOA territory. "The law is unambiguously on your side. You are not part of their HOA, period." "Then why will the police not intervene?" I asked, frustration evident in my voice. "Small-town politics," Carolyn replied matter-of-factly. "Let me guess, someone in the HOA has connections with local government or law enforcement." The question triggered a memory of something Frank had mentioned. I made a mental note to investigate those connections further. Carolyn outlined a comprehensive legal strategy that began with formal documentation of every incident and escalated through cease and desist orders to potential court action if necessary. The approach was thorough, but would take time to implement fully, time during which Barbara might continue her campaign against my property. "Document everything," Carolyn emphasized as our meeting concluded. "Every encounter, every text, every intrusion. Build an evidence file that would convince even the most skeptical judge." I spent the following evenings doing exactly that, organizing security footage, photographing property lines, documenting timestamps of intrusions, and recording conversations with neighbors. Several shared similar experiences with Barbara's boundary overreach, though none had resisted as firmly as I was doing. Frank provided the missing piece of the political puzzle during an evening conversation by our fence line. "Barbara's husband sits on the city council," he explained quietly. "Transportation committee chair. That is why the police are reluctant to get involved. Robert Winters oversees their department budget reviews." This revelation explained the systemic resistance I had encountered. Barbara was not just an overzealous HOA president. She was part of a local power structure accustomed to getting its way. "They tried this with the Martinez family on Cedar Street too," whispered another neighbor, Elaine, during our conversation at the community mailboxes. "They were outside the HOA boundary like you. Barbara had their vehicles ticketed repeatedly until they sold and moved away." With each conversation, the pattern became clearer. Barbara targeted properties along the boundary, pressuring owners until they either joined the HOA voluntarily or sold to buyers who would. It was a systematic expansion of her territory and authority. The commercial-grade security system installation felt like preparing for conflict. The technician raised his eyebrows at my specifications for coverage and alert settings: cameras with night vision, motion detection zones, automatic cloud storage, and real-time alerts to my phone. "Setting up Fort Knox here, huh?" he joked, mounting a camera with a clear view of my property lines. "Something like that," I replied, watching him work. As I signed the completion paperwork that evening, a plan began crystallizing in my mind. Barbara's approach relied on pressure and persistence, counting on eventual surrender. What if I appeared to give her exactly what she wanted, while simultaneously building a legal trap she could not escape? The following morning, HOA application forms arrived in my mailbox, a thick packet with Barbara's business card paper-clipped to the front. Through my kitchen window, I noticed her watching from her property across the development. I made a deliberate show of reviewing the documents at my dining table, occasionally glancing up as if contemplating the decision. That afternoon, I began filling out the forms where she could see me. I even walked to my mailbox with a pen, making notes in the margins as if seriously considering the application. Through my security cameras, I observed Barbara making a phone call immediately afterward, her expression triumphant. Meanwhile, I implemented the first phase of Carolyn's strategy. A formal boundary survey was scheduled, property line markers were refreshed with bright paint, and documentation of each trespassing incident was meticulously organized into a legal evidence binder. The strategy required patience and careful timing. Each day, I made visible progress on the HOA application forms while simultaneously documenting every violation Barbara committed. I arranged my schedule to appear frequently in my front yard when neighborhood board members drove past, always with the application papers visibly in hand. Barbara took the bait completely. Within days, she had escalated her garage intrusions, clearly confident that my resistance was crumbling. Each unauthorized entry, each instance of property damage, each text message claiming authority over my property was carefully added to my evidence file. 2 weeks into this strategic deception, I received an invitation to attend the monthly HOA meeting as a prospective integration property. The formal letter, signed by Barbara, outlined the agenda items including special territory integration and community storage solutions. I confirmed my attendance immediately, knowing this public meeting would be the perfect venue for the next phase of my plan. Barbara had created a paper trail, explicitly acknowledging my property was not currently part of the HOA, while simultaneously documenting her illegal attempts to claim authority over it. As I prepared my presentation materials for the upcoming meeting, a certified mail notification arrived from Carolyn's office. The legal documents inside represented the foundation of our counterattack: carefully drafted cease and desist orders, trespassing notifications, and property boundary affirmations. The timing had to be perfect. Barbara believed she was about to win, about to formally absorb my property into her domain. That false confidence would make the legal trap all the more effective when it finally closed around her carefully highlighted hair and diamond tennis bracelet. My certified letters landed like precisely targeted missiles across Oakwood Estates. Each envelope contained legally drafted documents detailing specific violations, trespassing incidents, and property damage with supporting evidence. The recipients included Barbara Winters, each HOA board member, the City Council, and the County Property Records Office. The legal language was exacting and comprehensive. Every unauthorized garage entry, every false claim of authority, every instance of property damage meticulously documented with dates, times, and photographic evidence. Each letter concluded with a formal demand to cease all activities on my property immediately or face legal consequences. Working with Carolyn, I had positioned no trespassing signs at strategic points along my property line. These were not standard hardware store warnings, but custom-printed legal notices that specifically named Barbara Winters, her daughter, and all Oakwood Estates HOA board members. This legal technicality strengthens any future case, Carolyn had explained. By specifically naming individuals, we create a clear record that they were explicitly forbidden from entering your property. The security company I hired provided daily monitoring during my absence, with instructions to prevent any HOA members from accessing my garage or property. Their presence was a visible deterrent, uniformed guards patrolling my property line during peak hours when Barbara typically conducted her community tour. The first direct confrontation under the new security protocol came quickly. My phone rang while I was reviewing quarterly reports at work. "Sir, this is Marcus from Sentinel Security," the guard reported. "I have prevented Mrs. Winters from entering your garage as instructed. She is demanding to speak with you immediately." I requested the guard maintain his position and inform Mrs. Winters that any communication should go through our respective attorneys. The security footage later showed Barbara gesturing angrily at my property, her face flushed with indignation as the guard calmly blocked her path. That evening, I attended the monthly city council meeting. The public comment session provided 3 minutes per speaker, more than enough time to execute the next phase of our strategy. I approached the podium carrying a simple folder containing selected security footage and documentation. "Good evening, council members," I began, my voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I am here to address ongoing harassment and trespassing issues perpetrated by an HOA against non-HOA properties in our community." The chamber fell silent as I methodically outlined the pattern of harassment, property invasion, and intimidation. As I spoke, security footage played on the projector screen, clearly showing Barbara entering my garage without permission, directing others to store equipment in my space, and confronting me on my own property. These actions constitute criminal trespassing, harassment, and potentially breaking and entering, I concluded. I have filed formal complaints and am pursuing all legal avenues available, but I believe the council should be aware of these systematic boundary violations occurring in our community. From the corner of my eye, I could see Robert Winters, Barbara's husband, shifting uncomfortably in his council seat. When discussion of my complaint began, the council chair immediately asked him to recuse himself due to the obvious conflict of interest. His face flushed as he collected his papers and left the chamber. As the meeting adjourned, a woman approached me in the lobby. Her press badge identified her as Catherine Mercer from the local Herald. "I cover local government for the Herald," she explained, extending her business card. "But this story about HOA boundaries and harassment might deserve its own investigation. Would you be willing to discuss this further?" The media interest represented an unexpected but valuable development in our strategy. Barbara had operated largely without public scrutiny, her tactics known only to those directly affected. A newspaper investigation would bring unwelcome attention to practices the HOA likely preferred to keep quiet. The following morning, Barbara made another attempt to access my garage. This time, the security guard captured video of her attempting to use a garage door opener, becoming visibly frustrated when the new frequency failed to respond. The evidence was immediately added to our growing legal file. By week's end, the certified mail receipts had returned, confirming each recipient had received our legal notices. Barbara's response came not through proper legal channels, but via a community newsletter hastily distributed throughout Oakwood Estates. The document claimed boundary protection initiatives were being undertaken to maintain community standards against non-compliant properties. This written admission of her campaign against properties outside HOA jurisdiction was another piece of evidence added to our file. Barbara's refusal to acknowledge legal boundaries, despite formal notification, strengthened our case considerably. The final development came when 3 other homeowners along the HOA boundary contacted me through Carolyn's office. Each had experienced similar harassment tactics, though none had documented their experiences as thoroughly. Their testimonies added crucial weight to our legal position, demonstrating a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. As we prepared for the court hearing regarding the restraining order, I realized Barbara had severely miscalculated. Her assumption that I would eventually surrender to pressure had led her to create an extensive record of her own violations, a record that would now be presented before a judge. The boundaries she had so confidently ignored were about to become legally enforced in ways she never anticipated. The county courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the sunlight. Inside Courtroom 3, I sat beside Carolyn, watching as Barbara and 3 HOA board members filed in with their attorney, a nervous-looking man who kept adjusting his tie. Judge Malcolm Henderson, a distinguished older gentleman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, called the session to order. His glasses reflected the evidence binder as he reviewed the meticulously organized documentation of every trespass, every unauthorized entry, and every false claim Barbara had made over the previous months. "The court has reviewed the submitted evidence," Judge Henderson announced after carefully examining the security footage showing Barbara's repeated unauthorized entries to my garage. "Based on the clear documentation provided, I find convincing evidence of harassment and trespassing." His pen moved decisively across the document as he signed the restraining order that legally barred Barbara and 3 HOA board members from coming within 100 feet of my property. The judge also ordered immediate cessation of all claims of authority over non-HOA properties and explicitly prohibited any communication regarding community standards or integration. Barbara sat rigid in her seat, her highlighted hair perfectly styled even in defeat, as the judge delivered his ruling. The boundaries she had so confidently ignored were now legally reinforced with potential criminal penalties for violations. 2 days later, the newspaper headline appeared above the fold. HOA boundaries crossed. Investigation reveals pattern of homeowner harassment. Catherine Mercer's thorough reporting included testimonials from multiple homeowners who had experienced similar intimidation tactics, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic boundary violations and abuse of authority. The public exposure triggered immediate consequences. An emergency HOA board meeting resulted in Barbara's removal as president, with a formal statement distancing the organization from her individual actions. The City Council convened a special session implementing new regulations requiring HOA boundary maps to be filed publicly and establishing clear penalties for harassment across property lines. 3 weeks after the court hearing, a certified letter arrived containing a check covering my garage floor repair and workbench replacement. A tersely worded apology letter accompanied it, Barbara's signature sharp and angry at the bottom of the page. The language was clearly crafted by attorneys, acknowledging regrettable misunderstandings regarding property boundaries, without directly admitting deliberate wrongdoing. Over the following months, both Teslas remained conspicuously absent from my property. Barbara and her daughter were occasionally visible in the neighborhood, but they changed direction whenever our paths might cross, maintaining the court-ordered distance. 6 months after the confrontation began, my garage stood fully restored. The concrete floor had been professionally refinished, the workbench rebuilt to my specifications, and new security features installed throughout the space. My vehicles parked exactly where they belonged, in a space that was unquestionably mine. The experience had created unexpected community bonds. The newly formed Non-HOA Neighborhood Association met monthly in different members' homes, sharing resources and watching boundaries. Frank hosted the first gathering, proudly showing off his garden while neighbors discussed property rights and mutual support. On a bright spring morning, I installed the final element in my garage restoration, a simple but elegant sign above the door. The wooden plaque, handcrafted in my now peaceful workshop, gleamed in the afternoon sun, "Private property by invitation only." The sign was not meant as provocation, but as a quiet statement of fact, a boundary marker as clear and undeniable as the legal documents now filed with the county. Barbara might have lost her battle to control my property, but I had gained something more valuable than victory. I had defined and defended my space, my rights, and my place in the community. The newly sealed garage.